Hello and good afternoon, TVI viewers. Welcome to Crossroads with Neethan and Shan. As you know, Crossroads is a weekly talk show dedicated to discussing a variety of topics that are relevant to the social, economic, and political and cultural advancement of Tamil Canadians. Federal elections in Canada is around the corner. The date most likely will be October 19. But the campaign itself may begin earlier than usual, earlier than expected. Some suspecting that the campaign could be launched as early as the early part of August. So on today's episode of Crossroads, we are going to be discussing the state of democracy in Canada, civic engagement levels, and possible electoral reforms. To discuss this critical topic, the first part of the show, we have two community builders with us. Ishrat Ahmed from Social Planning Toronto. Hi, Ishrat.
Hi, Neethan.
And Pat McGrail from Fair Vote Canada from the Peel chapter. Hi, Pat.
Hi.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us in this nice weather outside.
It's our pleasure.
So let's start with asking you, Ishrat, are people excited? You work as a social planner, you're seeing a lot of people. Federal obviously has a lot more engagement than provincial and municipal because of obviously it's the national election. But do you see people excited, people talking about it?
To be honest, the groups that I work with, some of them are newcomers, youth, and people of color, people who live in who are low income, fit into the bracket. They're not excited because it's not relevant for a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these groups actually don't participate in the election, so that's a concern for a lot of us. Mm-hmm. But we are trying our best to reach out to a lot of those voters who really don't participate most of the time, but we are trying to be very creative in reaching out to them and say, tell us, why don't you participate, and what are the things that are at stake? So that way we're trying to generate some interest among some of the people who are very hard to reach, who don't participate, who don't trust public institutions or politicians, and who are very disengaged at a very epic level. Mm-hmm. But some of us, we're trying our best, some of the community-based organizations, to reach out to them and say, let's talk about it.
It's like a vicious cycle when people don't participate. The politicians actually know which groups don't participate as much, and they don't tend to cater their message to those groups that are not coming out to vote because they probably think, this is over less, the return for your buck is not there, right? So all of a sudden you kind of have this cycle of disengagement continuing from both ends, right? So let's talk a bit about, engagement as it relates to electoral reforms, because I personally feel there's something wrong in the electoral system, and that's why there is a little bit of a disconnect as well. So there has to be some reforms, and you come from a particular organization that is pushing for proportional representation.
That's right. Fair Vote Canada promotes proportional representation at every level of government.
So how would that take care of some of the apathy and the disengagement that we are seeing, and what is proportional representation to begin with?
First of all, proportional representation, basically, if you were talking about at the federal level, would mean that each party would only have a number of MPs in proportional to the vote that they receive. Which under the current system in this particular government, and this has happened in many governments before, but with 39% of the vote, they got 60% of the seats and 100% of the power. Mm-hmm. And I think there's really, in the history of Canada, there's really only been two true majority governments. So this is kind of the sort of thing that we have. So you have a government making decisions.
When they haven't gotten the approval of the 60% of the population.
Exactly.
And then worse off, I'm not being partisan, but when you look at Green Party, for example, getting 10%, 12%, or even at certain places so much higher, not having any recently had representation, but not having any representation. So those people who supported that particular political party would have no voice at all, right?
That's true, and that's true. And under first past the post, part of the problem is the artificial boundaries created by the ridings, and so you're limited to who you can vote for. You're stuck within that boundary. So whereas if you looked at the vote across Canada, the groups that have their support spread across the country are not going to get nearly as many seats as the groups that have their support grouped in one area, like for example in Quebec. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason the NDP got so many seats is because their support was concentrated in mm-hmm. Quebec. Mm-hmm.
Now, before we go further about reforms and electoral stuff, let's talk a bit about issues. you belong to an organization called Social Planning Toronto, and you've done this before as well, but you're coming up with fact sheets on certain issues for the communities to use. Because the populations you mentioned are the most impacted by policies that are decided at the political level, right? Because they are more further marginalized, and they have direct impact of many of the policies, say the childcare or immigration and so on, right? What's the disconnect, and are you able to, where is the disconnect even?
So we have clearly seen the disconnect when we reached out to a lot of different groups. For example, people don't understand what the politicians do and what is the role of different levels of government. So when we talk about federal government or federal election, they really don't understand what the federal government does. So we started talking about issues, and then there were clear indication that there are few issues that came out very strongly. For example, people really don't see the relevance of some of the legislative changes or policy that took into effect in last few years. For example, people really, now they're seeing the impact, but they don't understand why those changes were made without any consent or consultation with people. So they find the whole aspect of public institution as very irrelevant to them. So, but issues were very critical. For example, childcare. It's a very important issue. Lack of affordable housing, transit infrastructure, very predominant. It came out in all our discussions, and people are impacted by immigration and family integration issues, and the fact that with the recent changes, it will take them more time to become a citizen. That impacts some of their livelihoods, so many different aspects of their life. So that has become an issue. Lack of support for ESL, for people. So those are really practical issues that people identified in this election, although they are not directly inclined to say that these are the federal issues but when we talk to them and people talk about these issues, and also the fact that we have lost long-form census, people do not see that as an issue, but a lot of people talked about that, that the level of poverty that we see, it's not being documented by government. So that impacts how funding gets allocated for different groups and services. And so people were able to identify all those different practical issues, how they're impacted, even though they wouldn't say that this is a federal issue.
And maybe there is not a lot of hope around that they could change it by changing government or electing somebody. Like, they don't connect changing that issue or resolving that issue to a political participation question, because they are talking about the issues but not necessarily. And
also there is this lack of understanding of how the political process, and also decision-making structures. So when we talk about why should you care, why should you vote, people really don't understand that there is a distinction between individual position on issues and party position. So when we engage in those discussions, people say, oh, I didn't know that. My MPP has, he supports this issue. But when we explain that, then it's not individuals that, it's the party that takes a position in this issue. So there are a lot of misconception, amongst people that I work with.
Okay.
So that's a huge problem.
So having accessible information is critical. Having information available in comprehensive terms, having it in different languages and so on has been helpful.
So this accessibility, actually, I can explain it in two different terms. In one hand, they really don't know that a lot of people, I'm not saying everyone, a lot of people really don't understand that there is a process involved. You cannot just show up for the day of the election. You need to register. There are certain things that you need to prepare with. So that is one.
It's even made worse.
Exactly. So that is one barrier.
Making it harder.
So that is one barrier. Another barrier, how do you read between the lines? Yeah. Because election is at the end of the day, it's a political campaign, and people's issues are usually not addressed, and it becomes a marketing campaign for political parties. So people really don't understand how to read between the lines.
Yeah. it's about sound bites and what media picks up and so on, right? So
Exactly.
I'm going to come back to you about political literacy in our communities further. But before that, she talked about a number of issues, and electoral reform, if you survey, is in many people's lowest priority because they are traditionally aren't thinking of that as being possible, right? One of the things that we noticed a few years back, I think it was 2007, when the province introduced a particular, very confusing for general public, and asked them to vote on it without giving enough tools to understand it, and it was actually rejected by the population as a result. So, what's the challenge for you?
Well, the challenge is getting people to understand what proportional representation is and how important it is. I mean, all of these issues that we want addressed, in order to make our votes count and get parties to move on them, they have to know that yes, we can vote them out and that our votes do count. And proportional representation would mean, most likely, as it happens in the many countries that have it, you would not have another majority government. You would have stable, proportional coalitions. They're much different than our minority governments because there's no incentive to go back to the polls. The coalition is what they have, and that's what they have to work with. And they have to work cross party lines. I mean, it's a more collaborative system, and it changes the incentives for politicians. Instead of being the first one across the line, they've got to reach across party lines in order to get the legislation they're interested in passed.
Yeah, but we find that politicians are very scared to use the word coalition, and also it's a term that's scaring a number of people. Why? Because this is a commonly used form of government in many countries, and still in Canada, when we're talking about collaborating between, is it because we only have 3 parties the collaboration becomes a little bit not possible, or?
I mean, we've had coalitions in this government, in this country. We've had them at provincial level, federal level, not often, but we have had them. I don't know, I mean, I was quite surprised, was it back in 2011, or no, it was before that, when the government was about to fall, and it was Harper who made the big fuss about coalitions, and I think... And
it still remains a bit of a...
Yes, I mean, he made it, sound like this was really something
completely
awful.
Undemocratic, right? So
it's undemocratic, like the world was going to fall apart if we did this, and I guess that was to his political advantage. The UK has just come off, up to the recent election. They had a coalition government there for 5 years, so it happens under first past the post, and it certainly happens in the over 80 countries that have proportional representation. Coalition governments are the norm.
So if you look at proportional representation, for example, if I'm a passionate person for childcare, I could actually form a party called Childcare Advocacy Party or Childcare Party, and if I have enough support in small pockets across the country, I might end up with 2-3 seats because there are enough people who consider that as the highest priority. And now if a government needs to form with my 3 seats, that could push an agenda as well, right? So there are a number of countries that have smaller parties that are focused on specific agendas that get the say because they are part of this proportional representation. Right?
It's generally recognized if you have too many parties that the parliament becomes somewhat dysfunctional, and so there usually is a threshold in place that you have to have, say, 5% of the vote before you get a seat, and that kind of eliminates having too many parties. And then the other thing people worry about, well, won't extremist parties get in? Well, first of all, they have to have that requisite support of 5% or whatever the threshold is. But what they will find when they get into Parliament is that they have to play ball with the guys who have the votes, because if they don't, they sit on the bench and they don't get anything passed. So PR coalition governments tend to be somewhat moderating of extremist views. I mean, you have the the cross-fertilization or cross-pollination of ideas, and you come to some sort of meeting point that takes you away from the extremism.
Great. So we're going to take a quick commercial break. After a few commercials, we'll come back and talk a bit more about political literacy and how parties feel about this change, because the election is coming up. Some of them have released their positions. So let's talk about it after a few minutes of commercials. Stay tuned.